rarely talk about those situations where we make missteps or mistakes. And so today, we're going to have a different kind of conversation. We're going to talk about failing, but failing forward, learning from those setbacks, from those missteps, and learning to leverage them to continue to advance our careers. So joining us today for this important conversation is Ileana Musa, the head of international banking and lending at Morgan Stanley Private Bank. Please welcome Ileana to the stage.
Hello,
awesome.
Hello.
Hey. Okay, so thank you for joining us today, Ileana. We're going to have a great conversation. And before we start talking about failing forward, moving beyond setbacks to achieve your full potential, I want to encourage the audience to think about the questions, think about the things they want to ask. And as Ileana and I are having this conversation, if something comes to mind, please ask your question. We're going to do Q&A a little bit different, and rather than waiting till the end, we're going to do it throughout our conversation. So please be on the lookout for the HACER team members who will be running the mics, and we will be taking our questions as we go. So to get us started today, Ileana, tell us a little bit about your journey and which values have helped you during challenging times.
Great to be here with you, Lisette. Congratulations on your new role. Where's Sid? I can't see anybody, but I wanted to thank Sid and the entire team for an amazing, amazing program. How many of you went out and did the golf clinic yesterday? Okay, awesome. And how many of you were intimidated when you thought about going on the golf course? Raise your hand. And so I thought the analogy about being on the green, trying to get on the green, and the conversation we're having today was very relevant because oftentimes we shy away from the things that we don't know. And what I'd like to explore with all of you today is when we lean into the unknown, we lead. And when we lean into the unknown, we earn the right to fail and to pick ourselves back up and go back at it. And if you think about yesterday, that's what we all did. You hit the ball, you have a couple of good swings, and then you have a really bad one. And you have to make a decision, do you go back at it or do you convince yourself that you're not good enough for the sport? And so there's a lot of learnings from yesterday's experience to what we're going to talk about today, which translates into not just a professional setting, but a personal setting too. And I want to talk a little bit about what we do at home as well, because it does make a difference for us as women, Latina, professionals, mothers, in the way we think about these pivotal moments in our careers and the way we interpret them, because it's either going to propel you because you're using it as a learning moment to get more energy and strength to do better the next time, or you're going to let it convince you that you shouldn't stay in the game. So we are all in the long game, as I like to say, Lisette. And so for me, I was born in Cuba. I'm Cuban American. I'm an immigrant. I was raised by a single mom of 3. At the time, we were just talking about it over lunch. I spent the first decade of my life waiting for my family to get reunited because my father ended up staying behind in Cuba, ended up serving a 15-year prison term, and that reunification didn't happen until I was 17. Wow. So being raised by a single mom, you get an inside look at a lot of experiences that really have shaped who I am. So let's dig into that a little bit. I always say I had a master class in R&R, risk-taking and resilience. I had a single mom that saw, a lot of rejection, getting jobs with 3 kids, evictions, you name it, just trying to navigate in a new country, not knowing the language, not having family, and breaking new ground for the purpose of providing for our family and making sure that we all anchored ourselves on education. Education was very, very important in our household. And so observing that, but also getting to participate, because my mom was very hands-on, and so for those of you in the room that remember the Yellow Pages, probably many of you don't. You're using Yelp at this point, but The Yellow Pages was a very important resource in my household. We used to actually run when the mail was going to deliver the next version of the Yellow Pages, because that was my mother's network. That's how she built contacts in this foreign country and started to establish relationships with many people, and she was brilliant at it. So building relationships, which we'll talk a lot about. So for me, the values are courage, which comes from this whole notion of taking risks and being very resilient and going after things over and over again. Adaptability, being able to flex, because as we all face adversity, it's our ability to pivot. And you know, we talked this morning about being Latina in the workplace and how do we show up in a way that works for the workplaces. And so the analogy I use is when we all take trips, we don't pack the same suitcase, right? If you think about where you're going, you adapt the way you're going to show up, where you're going to have the best vacation possible. So we need to do the same thing in the workplace. In some moments, in some settings, we can be very nurturing, and we can be very inviting and very empathetic. And in other settings, we need to show up differently. And so being able to flex and adapt is really important, and I have found it to be a very important tool that I pull and I evaluate and I use strategically depending on the setting, so adaptability. And the final one is service. You know, when we think about failing forward, forward is the word of the day as I think about our time together, which is not only how do you fail forward in terms of using experiences as a process to get better, to propel us to do more, bigger, but also to pay it forward. Because with every stepping stone and the success that we get to have, we get to bring others along. And one of the most rewarding things about my career has been building teams, helping individuals develop, and then seeing them flourish and shine throughout their careers. And so those are the three that I would highlight, have really shaped me as a leader.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I really like that analogy of the suitcase, right? And actually, never really thought about it from that perspective. So I think, you know, I always understood, like, oh, you have to know your audience, you have to know what they need and how you're going to work with them. But the analogy of the suitcase is like perfect because it helps you sort of really remember that different situations require different tools, different resources, different ways, yes. Right? And the whole idea of being flexible, I think, is really important. And perhaps maybe one of the things that we talk about, but maybe we don't always all know exactly what that means and how to do it, right? So maybe we can unpack that a little bit as well. So you've talked about, you know, courage, adaptability, service, and all of these things being important, being necessary for overcoming fears. But how have they shaped your professional career, right? So can you give us some specific examples?
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, growing up, so I was going to be a dancer. I was not going to work in finance. And we all have, you know, so I always say when I talk to students, and I spend a lot of time with students, you know, you don't get stressed about not having all the answers. And professionally, too, we don't need to have all the answers. We just need to know where we're going. I knew at a very young age I wanted to lead. I knew I had a knack for transformational efforts because of my childhood experiences. And I knew I wanted to win. Siri's with us, but I don't know where she is. I don't have a phone, so, and it's not my watch. Okay, so maybe Siri has a question. So let me go back and think about my thought. So what I would say is for me as a child growing up, I didn't have anybody at home that worked on Wall Street, okay? I meet my father at 17. He was an entrepreneur, started his business again in his early 60s after finally getting out of Cuba. And he's the one who convinced me and really pretty much said, listen, why don't you minor in dance and major in finance? And he just leaned into me really hard. And I said, okay, I'll do it. I love numbers. And so that's what got me on a very different path. And then he convinced me to get my MBA. And it was really that relationship. And it wasn't a father-daughter relationship at that point. I was getting to know my father for the first time in 17 years. And so, but it was the advice of a business leader And he just had a lot of passion and felt that I could still continue to dance, which I do today, but professionally apply my skills differently. So that was one of those pivotal moments. My mother, on the other hand, was very much also an entrepreneur. She did all types of sales and took us with her and made us sell at a very young age. And then she also made us negotiate a lot. Now, we're going to talk about negotiation, but as Latinas, we often talk about putting our heads down and working. I observed a woman do the complete opposite. She had to lean in, she had to build relationships, build trust, and she asked. She was excellent at asking. So I got very comfortable with asking when I finally moved to New York to break into private banking. I called a lot of recruiters. I made literally hundreds of calls till somebody took my call, because while I had a lot of work experience, I didn't have specific experience in private banking. And so leaning in, a million no's, you're going to get to a yes. And sure enough, I got the one recruiter that said, come see me, put me in front of the head of the Southern Cone for Bank Boston, and I landed my first job. So the other story I'll share with you is last year of my husband's master's studies, we moved to Moscow, January. I'll never forget. It was freezing. I didn't speak Russian. My husband did, but he was in school 12 hours a day, and I was going to lose my mind. We were living with a Russian lady who rented us her apartment, and so she and I would spend hours in the kitchen. I learned how to cook Russian. She learned how to cook Cuban. I took my pressure cooker. Imagine my Cuban parents sending me off to Russia. You can just imagine. So 110 pounds of food. I mean, they packed me for 3 winters. And so after a while, I said, I need to get work. I need to do something. But everybody was like, you don't speak the language. You're not going to be able to get work. And I said, yes, I am. So I got the yellow pages. And I started to call. And sure enough, I finally got to an owner. I used to teach fitness. I got to an owner of a spa who spoke English, who had spent time in South Beach, loved Miami, and we hit it off. And I said, I'm looking for a job. In fact, I will work for free. And he said, come see me tomorrow. And I got a job at his gym teaching fitness for the entire time that I was there. And so it's the way, it's really all about mindset. It's the way we think about opportunities and challenges and the way we lean in with conviction that I find really makes a difference in the outcome.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to remember. And I think when we think about when an obstacle presents itself or when we make a misstep, we're so demoralized, yes, right? Like we get so hung up on the fact that this bad thing is happening that we don't think about how can we take that and make it something positive, right? How can we leverage whatever that situation was to actually then become successful at perhaps something else, right? And I think we just get caught up in the negativity that we forget that it's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for us to learn. It's an opportunity for us to do something different. I'm sure when you went to Russia, you never imagined teaching fitness classes there, right? So it was an opportunity, and I think that's the important part. You capitalized on it, right? And so it's really important to have that perspective. Would you say that sort of the way that you view those setbacks has evolved over time? Yeah, so tell us.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you imagine you're building a failure resume. If you were all tasked now to take out a sheet of paper and build a failure resume, you'd have to indicate every setback that you've had throughout your career, even personally, quite frankly, and what you got out of that. Because that's where we don't spend enough time thinking about how we grew from those experiences and how that then translated into better skills, proficiency, right? If we don't fail, we ultimately cannot learn. I say it all the time. If you haven't had any setbacks throughout your career, you're not going to be prepared for a crisis. So thinking and being more thoughtful on what are those, where have you tripped, where have you had those speed bumps, what have been the setbacks, but what have you gained from that? Because it's not just about moving on, it's about recognizing where the gaps were and then what are you going to do about it. And that's what's allowed me to become a stronger leader. So how has it evolved? It's evolved a lot. Number one, you need to be 60% ready to pursue an opportunity. As women and as Latinas, I would say even more, we want to be 110% ready. And so when the opportunity comes knocking, we're usually apologetic. We want to think through it. We want to ask our family. I'm going to go talk to my family about it, and I'll come back to you. I'm going to talk to my parents and my abuelos. And, we're very Community driven, and it's great, but keep that outside of work, right? So when the opportunity comes knocking, is it something that gives you fire in the belly? Yeah, so my philosophy has always been, and how it's evolved is, when I get asked that opportunity, I'll say yes. I want to talk more about it tomorrow. I'm super excited. Thank you so much for considering me. And then I go and do my homework and think about all the things I want to discuss as it relates to how I'm going to make that role work for me. As opposed to saying, I'm not sure, let me think about it. Do you think? Very different conversation. I'm setting the stage with yes, I'm pumped up about this. Now I'm going to make the role work for me. Something I didn't do early in my career, I do that now a lot. The other thing is setting a vision about what you'd like to do. So I always say we're all focused on what we're doing currently. Think about the last performance review you had. You were probably, 90% of that conversation was, what are you doing well within the role that you have now? How much time did you allocate to talk about your vision for what you want to do and be? So it's really important. I call it the dripping strategy. And that I did since very early in my career. Didn't matter who I was sitting with, I would always paint a picture of, I wanted to lead. I'm really good at transformational projects. If we ever go global, I want to play a role there. Let me tell you a little bit about my experience in international markets. And so people start to remember when those opportunities come up. And so thinking bigger, planning backwards. This is the other analogy around golf. How do you plan backwards and play forward? I'm going to let that sink in for a moment. Plan backwards and play forward. If you think about the pro players, many of them, they don't stand at the tee and think about how they're going to get it to the green. They actually go to the green and then think backwards, what are the plays they need to do to get to that target? And so for us, we need to think about, what's our goal? If we think 3 years out, where do we want to be? What are the things we want to do? And then ask ourselves, what are the things I need to do? What are the milestones to be able to get there? Because we need to have that vision, and we need to talk about that vision to get others just as excited as us. But too often, we talk about the role we're doing now, the work we need to do, and we don't paint that picture. And that's a best practice I've also learned over the years.
I really love that idea, right? Planning backwards and playing forward, right? Like thinking about what is that ultimate goal and how do I get there, right? And maybe we don't do that enough. And you said something else that I thought, here's the researcher in me coming out, right? Like thinking about the research that's out there about gender dynamics in the workplace and the way that certain things operate differently for men and women, right? So thinking about how, you know, everyone I'm sure has heard this, when a man sees a job opening, you know, that perhaps they have 10% of what the job opening says you need to actually have to have the position, they apply for it. And women will look at the job opening, and if they have 90% of it, they're like, no, I don't have everything, right? I can't apply for it. I don't have this one bullet point that it says I need to have, right? And that, for me, fundamentally is about taking risk, right? And we perhaps are not often as eager to take that risk, but taking risk is really important to help advance your career. So can you share with us some of your thoughts about taking risk, the process maybe that you undertake when you're thinking about it?
Two things there. So I have, you know, if we had enough time, I'd share a lot of stories about moments where I've been asked to take on new roles because I've been painting a picture around what I'd like to do long term, and those opportunities then come up. Or I pick up the phone and I say, I saw this role just opened up. I know you're thinking about how you're going to fill that role or restructure. I'd like to throw my name in the hat when the time is right. So I just make it be known that I'm interested. Now, two things that you need to work on, I call it the reservoir. How do you build the reservoir so you have the capacity and the wherewithal to be able to fail and learn and pick yourself back up? So one is your brand. How do you build your brand? I mean, we could have a whole talk on branding, but that is really important. And number two is your network. These are two levers that you can pull very strategically to allow yourself to have those setbacks, to allow yourself to pick yourself back up and go back at it. Why is the network important? Because if you surround yourself with individuals that think differently than you, that are not giving you just what you want to hear, but are going to talk to you straight. When you're having those moments of doubt, they get you back on track, right? So when I was going to first take my first global role, I was trying to grow my family. All of my girlfriends said, not the right time, don't do it. And I was about to go back to my boss and say, I love the opportunity, but I can't really be traveling globally now. It's, all those things, the conversations we have with ourselves that don't serve us well. And I said, I'm going to call 3 people in my network. These are folks that, if you think about people more senior to you, people at your level, and then those that you're helping to bring up. To me, that's how I define a network. So I called 3 of them, and one of them, Ron, he's still a dear friend till this day, he said, of course I would take the job. I would take the job, and if in 3 months it doesn't work for me, I'd leave the job. Just like that. Very matter of fact, didn't think about it twice, and I was like, okay, well, then I'm taking the job. So I called my boss, and I'm like, I can't wait to take this job. Then, as I said, the homework was, how am I going to make this job work for me? And that's when I built a top-notch team around me so that I could send them to travel when I couldn't go. So, building teams is one of the things I've done throughout my career, and it's getting the all-stars, folks that are going to take over my job, that can really be leaders. And that is so important because that's what's going to allow you to delegate and to make the workplace work for you. And so those are some of the best practices, Lisette, that I've used to really help me navigate that, leveraging that network, and then building your brand. As it relates to brand, here are 3 things I would say. Clarity, need to know where you want to go, what we just talked about, right? How do you plan backwards, play forward? Number 2, authenticity. We talk about authenticity, about showing up who we are. I want to give you a different perspective on authenticity. Authenticity is our ability to reach over, break down a silo. Because if you think about it, silos are human constructs. We create them. We think that only this group of people belongs at this table. But you all have the power to break that down by leaning in and by becoming part of that circle. And when you break down silos, you build trust. And where there's trust, you can do anything. So when I think about authenticity, I think about how do I show up in a way that I can lean into others when others are a little bit fearful about leaning in towards me because they don't know me, they don't know Latinas, they haven't worked with women, et cetera. I will overstretch. I will lean in to try to break down that barrier, break down those silos, and once I build the relationship, I can do anything with that individual. So it's a different way to think about building relationships and trust, which is so important, to then building your network, to having that reservoir when you have those setbacks.
That's great advice. So I can't quite see out into the audience, I'm going to be honest. I can see down this middle path, and I can see, I think, Shanae over there standing there. Do you have a question from someone? Is that why you're over there? Yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm Dara, and I'm with Nike. The question I have for you is, when you first started talking, you mentioned that you wanted to win, you wanted to do everything, and that was like early on in your career. And then with the risk-taking, you talked a lot about delegation and being able to take everything on your shoulders and properly delegate it. How did you build that skill? Because I feel like early on in a career, when you're really trying to just do everything and impress, it's hard to be like, okay, I also need to delegate.
Yes, really important point. You go from being an individual contributor and driving your own results. And by the way, when you think about building your brand, clarity, authenticity, consistency is the other big pillar. You have to deliver results to women all the time. Before you go, articulating your vision for the next job, be the best at what you do. Be the best. Think about who is the best in the role that you're in and aim for that. Because building a track record is what gets you noticed. Once you get noticed, you get the mentors, you get the sponsors. Sponsors are the ones that advocate for you, that are pushing for you to get that next big assignment. But it's all grounded on your ability to deliver results. So spend a lot of energy wherever you are in your career, being the best, becoming a subject matter expert, because that's how you're gonna build your brand. You can have great ideas, but if you're not delivering those results, it starts to fall apart. So your point is, you become an individual contributor, you work really hard, I worked nights, I worked weekends, my laptop was, attached to my back. I mean, I was relentless about it. And then as I started to transition into leadership roles, I now had a team. I had to either build a team or I took over teams. There was a big shift there because you now have to start to influence. And then you also transition from roles where you're leading people that are your direct reports to leading few and influencing many. Like when I was national sales manager, I didn't have a lot of direct reports, but I was trying to change mindsets, hearts and minds of a lot of people. So the way you do that is you think about folks, and this gets to some of the conversation you had on your walk about how do you say no, because we all get very comfortable with saying no. So what I like to do is I say no and volunteer somebody to solve the problem that they're trying to solve. If I can't do a speaking engagement, I'll give 3 names of individuals that potentially could be available that could step in. And so you want to think about within the ecosystem where you work, who are the people that you're either going to work directly with in your unit, in another department, that could potentially help solve problems. As you start to lead teams, then there's people within your world that you can develop so they can do it. And by the way, that means you have to trust them with being able to fail too. Because the nice thing about giving ourselves a space to learn, to grow, to have setbacks, to pick ourselves back up, is you get to allow others to do it too, because they're observing that you're giving yourself that space. They can do it too, they become stronger, and that's what allows you to then delegate to them. So you have to build a high-performing team to the extent that you have direct reports to be able to delegate. If you don't have a direct team, then you have to think about who are your partners that you can bring in, and that gets to building relationships. Think about how you're spending your time at work outside of your business unit, building relationships. I do that when I join a new company. When I joined this company with Morgan Stanley 5 years ago, as soon as I got in, I started to make a list. Who knows who that I need to know? And I started to put it on my calendar quarter by quarter, 5 more people that I need to connect with. And that's how you build a network. That's what's going to help you be able to tap other people to solve problems.
So I really love that idea of, sort of thinking about if I can't do something, who do I know that could,
Yes.
right? And I think that's a really important message for us in this group, right? And amongst us, because we don't always have to do it all ourselves, but we need to have people that we can rely on. And look to your left, look to your right, in front of you, behind you, like these are potential people that you can rely on in the future, right? So that's why these kinds of events and having conversations like this are so important for not only our own professional development, but for everybody who's coming behind us, right? And sometimes we don't think about that, and we don't think about, it doesn't always have to be me,
Yes.
right, that solves the problem. I can help someone else, right, by having them do the work to solve the problem, right? So remember that. Now, I know this is not a shy audience, so I know that there are more questions. I think I see Illy in the back with her hand up.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. I'm also from Nike. So when you were talking about that plan backwards and play forward aspect, as someone who sometimes is intimidated by that 3-year, 5-year plan and like trying to find out what that end goal is, but maybe I know what gives me energy and what I want that dream job or that dream goal to look like. Do you have any advice on how to actually define it so we can do that plan?
Yes. Caitlin, thanks for the question. So it's an important point. I didn't know that I wanted to be the head of international banking and lending at Morgan Stanley in 2017. I didn't know that. What I did know was when I broke into private banking, I knew, for example, that I was on the banking side of the equation, and then I wanted to learn investments. I didn't know that I eventually would become a manager in the investment, wealth management side of the house, but I knew I wanted to learn investments as a stepping stone to round out my skill sets. So one way to think about it is the skills you want to hone to make you a stronger leader. In my case, I knew I wanted to learn investments. I had to go get 8 licenses, and I talked to my manager about it. Even though it wasn't about a specific role, it was professional development. And on the professional development side, right, it's how do we get comfortable with doing the hard well? Do the hard well. Think about the things that you shy away from because you think they're too difficult, and lean into them. You're leaning into the unknown, and that's what's going to make you stronger. So in my case, I said, I want to learn investments. I'm going to go get my licenses. I talked to my manager and said, I'm not sure if I'm going to work on the investment side of the house, but would you sponsor me to get my licenses? And of course, he said yes. And then I spent 18 months doing that. That then puts me on a different track because now I have a different skill set. And so then I was considered and I was tapped to be a regional executive on financial management, not banking. And so think about those skills that you want to develop. P&L, which I would encourage all of you, regardless of what you're doing, learn the finances of the businesses that you're in. The technical skills of the businesses that we're in make you a stronger leader. So is it product? You want to learn product within the company? Do you want to learn about operations? Do you want to learn about service? Do you want to learn about sales? So sometimes, to your point, it's very intimidating to think about, in 5 years, I break it into chunks. What are you going to do for the next 2023? What are the 3 things you're doing? I tell my team all the time, I want to see 3 things around your professional development that you're committing to that we're going to hold you accountable to. 3 things. That becomes much more manageable. 3 things this year times 3 years, that's 9 things you've mastered. That's pretty impressive. What happens is we talk in generalities and we say, oh, eventually I want to become a managing director, but it's so general. And then the 3 years go by and we haven't really mastered much of anything other than what we're doing day to day. So break it down into chunks that you're going to be motivated around to execute against. Hopefully that helps.
I can't quite see, so I'm going to see, I think I see Shanae moving across the room. Here we go.
I can't believe you see anything.
So I have a question on, and you sound like you've always had a very clear vision, but what do you do if you realize that maybe that vision you've been working towards isn't really what you want anymore? Or how do you evaluate that? Have you experienced something like that before?
Sure. So when I was going to school, I was working full-time in real estate sales. Okay, that's what I did. I was learning how to manage an office because, again, I knew I wanted to manage. I knew I wanted to lead. I was good with organizational skills, and I was good selling. I mean, I had sold pastelitos and donuts, and I was a cheerleader, and I did a bunch of fundraising. So I knew I could sell. So I got into real estate, not because I knew I was going to get into real estate, but because I met someone who knew somebody who was hiring somebody at the real estate office. So it was not intentional at all. But I did well in that role. I had to sell. I got a lot of rejection. You know, real estate sales, it's all commission-based. So when I got my MBA, my husband says, we're going to Russia. I'm going to finish my studies, and then we're going to come back through New York. So then he said, let's move to New York. And I said, I'm not moving to New York. He said, well, okay, 1 year. And I said, okay, I'll do 1 year. And so when I got to New York, I wasn't going to do real estate sales. And at that point, I was saying, you know, I have an MBA. Do I want to continue doing real estate? So it was a pivotal moment for me to say, no, I think I want to go after something completely different. I want to break into the banking industry, but I didn't have any experience in banking. So then what do you do? So then you start to think about what are your transferable skills? And again, just like your failure resume, there's an exercise to say, here's everything I've done, and how does that transfer to other industries, to other sectors, to other roles, right? If you have done transformational projects, like in my case, around businesses, I could use that in any industry, in any sector. I'm sure it's the same for you. So that's a really, if you have a revelation that you want to go do something else, embrace that. Don't fight it. You know, I forget the statistic you might know in terms of research, but the average person has multiple career changes in their lifetime. So it's actually the norm, it's not the exception. So if you want to do that, embrace it, go for it, and then start to talk to people in some of the areas where you think you'd like to explore. I certainly did that in private banking. I did that on the investment side. I'm doing it now in terms of board service, just talking to a lot of people to get a sense for what's the day in the life of, what do they love, what do they not like, to get a better sense for what you could potentially want to do. But it's okay not to know. If there's anything you walk away with, it's okay not to know. Embrace the process, not the outcome. The process will get you to the right answer. Focus on who are the people you're going to talk to. What are the courses you're going to take? What are the skills you want to hone? And that's going to get you to the right answer. We spend too much time saying, why do I not know the answer? Why do I not know the answer? And then that's not really productive. It doesn't help you get to the right outcome.
And I would add, I think, too, just quickly before we take that next question that's out there, I think the transferable skills piece is really important, right? Take a step back, look at how you talk about what you do, and oftentimes you find that you talk about it in terms of the specific things, right? Not necessarily the big picture, the things that you could take from one sector to the next. And that going through that exercise is so important for you, even if you're staying within the same industry, just want a different type of role, right? When you go through that exercise, you learn a lot about yourself and about the kinds of positions that you could potentially be interested in just from doing that exercise.
Thank you. Lourdes Rosado from Latino Justice. I wanted to get your perspective on something, Ileana. I'm always impressed when leaders take responsibility for making mistakes, when they have a setback or make a mistake and say, hey, I messed up here, or something didn't go as I planned, and here's what I'm going to do to fix it or mitigate it. I think it's really powerful, but at the same time, there's a little part of me that says, like, well, you know, as a woman, Latino women generally say I'm sorry too much sometimes and take responsibility for things that they didn't do. And so I was just wondering what your perspective on that was.
That gets to, thank you, Lourdes, for the question. It's so important. And it goes beyond being Latina. It's so communicating with impact. The language we use matters. The way we acknowledge the setback is really important. You don't need to show up to, how many times do we show up to a room and we're 5 minutes in and we're going, I'm so sorry that I'm late. And there's the next person that walks in and says, thank you for waiting for me, I was with a client. Sounds very different. So the language we use to frame the conversation really matters. If there's a setback in the business around time to go to market, the product didn't work, I mean, there's a whole host of reasons. I had a boss who's a very senior executive at one of the major banks, and he would always say, you know, any given quarter, I'm throwing 10 ideas at the board, one of them's gonna stick. So 9 out of his 10 are not gonna make it. Completely comfortable with that. The way he has conversations about that is through the lens of innovation. So the way we frame the conversation about we tried something, and we were testing it to see if this was the best way to go to market or if this was the outcome we could drive. This is what we learned, and as a result, we're gonna pivot and we're gonna go in this direction. That sounds very different to saying, I'm sorry, we invested resources in this project, it didn't work. So again, it's thinking about that as a learning process, and the way you articulate that is just that. It's a learning process. And the reason that's important is because that's the way you innovate. You don't innovate. When you think about a prototype, how many prototypes do you need to get to market? It's thousands. And so same thing in business. And so the way we position that really matters, and we need to use strong language. We cannot use weak language. Don't be apologetic. Embrace it as a strength because you had the courage to go try and test something, and the reason you're pivoting is because it's not great for the company, it's not great for the division, it's not great for the shareholders. Are you okay?
Yes. With 5 seconds left, all of a sudden I get this tickle in my throat. Well, my friends, that is the end of our time together today. So let's give Ileana Musa a round of applause for sharing her insights. I hope you've all been able to take some strategies and some of the insights that Ileana has shared with us today to think about how you can leverage the setbacks that perhaps you'll face in your career to your advantage moving forward. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.